thinking principals, this presentation is for you. Thinking about what's inside of the black box, right? This is what principals really need to know, is the real work and how improvement happens, especially inside the classroom. So think of these as key leadership insights, right? We spend all this energy on standards and like curriculum and even thinking about assessments, but what the learning that actually happens in the daily interactions between the teachers and students, I call that the black box, right? The black box of instruction where achievement is made and lost sometimes. So really think about you as a principal. How do we make this shift from instructional conversations, from coverage and pacing to student thinking and evidence of learning? So Paul Black and Dylan Williams, they kind of say something that can kind of stop us pretty much in our tracks. It seems to be strange to leave the most difficult piece of the standards raising puzzle entirely to kind of teachers, right? And so if we really think about that for a moment, as leaders, we are very comfortable with managing the inputs, of course, the standards, the curriculum, the pacing guides, and et cetera, and even the schedules. But as we continue to grow, we constantly judge the outputs, right? The test scores, the data, the accountability ratings, etc., right? But with the most complex work, the daily instructional needs that kind of determine whether students actually attain the information, we often leave behind to individual teachers that are kind of unsupported. So think of what do we need to do, because many times in these situations we're hoping for the best, right? So this space in the middle, like I said, continuing with the black box of the classroom interaction, is where the learning actually happens, right? It's where the students either get explicit guidance or kind of left to kind of guess, right? Where they're practicing the feedback or practicing or changing the mistakes that happen, where they're engaging in real life content and thinking about it, complex context and how it relates to the world, or they're just in compliance silently in the classroom, right? And so thinking about, if we want to raise standards, we just can't continue to, manage around content or instruction anymore, right? We have to kind of dive in, we have to look inside of it. So we're not, of course, blaming our teachers, it's our job for leadership to kind of inspire teachers as well as help with instruction, right? To build systems to make instruction better, right? More likely optional, allow students to attain content, because when we leave kind of this hardest thing to change, gaps widen, they persist. And so when we lead with instruction and we are intentional, we know our outcomes change, and that's kind of what this conversational shift is about. So think of this as novices don't learn like experts, right? So what research says is, of course, novice learners lack the kind of the background knowledge, which we know, and the mental frameworks, right, the schemas that experts truly rely on. And so when students are asked to kind of figure it out too early, misconceptions continue to grow and not mastery, right? And so thinking of what is your move as a leader. So we as leaders have to ensure that our teachers are not kind of skipping that explicit instruction in the name. So we think of this explicit instruction kind of like this bridge and kind of not this crutch. So effective instruction kind of we talk about always, it follows this progression, right? We talk about the I do, where the teacher models the thinking and the processes, the we do, the guided practice with feedback, and of course the you do is the independent, application where the success of students is demonstrating, right? So with leaders, the ultimate goal is to kind of, how do we look for the gradual release during our walkthroughs, right? That independent work should come after the guided success, and we know definitely not before. So I know you have been walking in. So I say this slide kind of means a lot. It's kind of the most important mindset shifts that we need to have in our schools, and our schools kind of need to make. We know assessment is not something we do after learning, right? That's kind of a big caveat, something that we talk about but we don't do in practice, right? Assessment is something we do during learning. We all know that. So when assessment is used to kind of only judge through grades, points, percentages, etc., it comes too late, right, to change outcomes. But when assessment is kind of used to inform instruction, it becomes like most of the powerful levers that we actually have and tools that we have to have. So thinking of these strategies, they're difficult. And also consider the background probe, right? It helps when teachers kind of avoid this false assumption that students are kind of starting at the same place, right? It allows for instruction to begin where students actually are, right? Not where the curriculum kind of assumes they are or says they need to be, right? So when we think of like the traffic lights, right? Giving teachers instant nonverbal feedback, real time, really they answer the most important instructional question that we have is, do students need the support right now, right? This is kind of the roughest points, right, that invites this conversation. And then it tells if the students are not understanding, then we kind of lost it at that point, right? It's the data that we're following. And we tell teachers exactly where we need to reteach. We think of a memory matrix, to check where the students can organize, retrieve knowledge, not just kind of recognize it. It's kind of that learning that transfers. So here's what we need to think about as leaders. Like when we grade everything, of course, it slows learning. When we gather evidence or respond, it accelerates learning, right? This is not about kind of adding more assessments because we already have enough assessments. It's about kind of using the ones that we have to a little differently, right? And so think about our role as leaders is to kind of think of this as a feedback, continuous growth. How do we respond faster? How do we show evidence of learning? And then we can continuously work on less students kind of falling behind and needing intervention later. So that brings me to, are you in the classroom, leaders, right? Principals, are you in the classroom giving feedback, right? That powerful feedback that continues to close the gap. And what I see is a lot of our leaders, they're giving feedback, a lot of praise, vague comments. Some leaders I know give kind of a grade, right? Thinking of what is the high impact feedback, specific prompts tied to the learning, intended that we kind of require students to revise or extend their thinking. And so as a leader, whether you're the principal or the coach, try to give feedback that kind of demands action and not this compliance. So then this brings me to this thought of like the metacognition, right? Thinking about our thinking and how it accelerates our learning. Thinking of how do we teach our students to kind of plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning that can produce months of academic growth and acceleration. So with even minimal costs, right? And so as leaders, we constantly think about, okay, how do we encourage our teachers to explicitly teach thinking strategies and not just assume that our students already have them. So we know we're constantly fighting with these patterns, right, that are happening, right? The phone usage, maybe tech addiction, sleep inconsistencies at home, just inactivity, to academic students are at academic risk. And just thinking about how do we support our students, our families with training, just to be informed. Even this AI, how can parents and families be informed and how do we get ahead of this? So thinking of what we're doing as leaders to either partner with counselors, to talk to families about sleeping habits, bring up current statistics on what's happening in the world and how our students are being affected by it, have MTSS teams, professional development for families and parents early. And so thinking of what do we need to do for prevention because it beats intervention all the time. So I hate to say this. Let me name something you already see in your building, right? Even if you haven't heard of it or even the language of it. So from Monday to Thursday, student behavior and academic routines are relatively stable, right? Students wake up at the similar times. They move through predictable schedules, right? The learning behaviors stay consistent, but Friday is just different, right? And so thinking of behavioral science, that weekend behaviors don't start on Saturday. They begin on Friday, right? That's pretty much the break point. So mood shifts, activity levels change, sleep patterns begin to slide. And kind of here's that leadership implication. Friday is not a throwaway day. I see in so many schools, Friday is Fun Friday, Free Friday, Testing, Makeup Friday, right? And I always feel that Friday is a leverage point, right? So what happens in instructional content on Friday can either set students up for the cognitive drift of the weekend or pretty much stabilize routines and protect the learning momentum, right? And this is a critical window, I think, when we talk about those academic nudges, right? These moves matter here. So thinking about the retrieval practice instead of heavy new content, metacognition, just reflection, what did you learn this week? What will you need on Monday? Clear expectations of learning, unfinished learning, right? Brief plannings for the week to help students carry the learning forward. I'm not talking about kind of adding onto your plate or adding extra work, but it's just strategic timing, right? And so when we think about this Friday gap, it just continues to widen instructional content. But when we as leaders use Friday as intentional, learning comes a little bit more resilient. And so really thinking about, this takeaway just being, if we want consistent outcomes, we have to lead with consistent routines, right? Especially in a time where they're likely to break. So as you know, I'm always talking about equity, right? So active learning is strategy for equity and inclusion, thinking about structured evidence, active learning, and how, active learning continues to thrive. So think of 33% of achievement gaps, right? And 45% of course failure rates for unrepresented students. But really thinking about, as a leader, how do we frame active learning as kind of one of those non-negotiables, right? This is our commitment to equity, right? It's not a classroom preference. It's something that we are all continuing to do. We are all focusing on. Last but not least, I want to say just stop guessing, right? This is an equity lever that you could use. Curriculum alone won't close the gaps, neither will technology, neither will the rah-rah motivation, right? Instruction will. Say it with me. Instruction will, right? So when we're thinking about as a leader, where does the lecturing sit and get still happen in my building? And do all the students get guided practice before kind of independent? And then are we measuring engagement or kind of evidence of thinking? And so I always say, stop guessing, start using evidence for data to guide instruction, and design instruction that continues to close the gap, and it's not by chance, right? So this is how schools move from intention to true impact. Hope these tips help. Talk to you later for more. Bye.